Is that, oh yeah, that's better. Just let final people move around. For those who don't know me, my name's Toby Selman. I founded and run Africa Logistics Properties. In terms of built space, I think we're the biggest developer now of Grade A industrial space in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we've focused on Kenya for a start. So I was just going to talk today about the market, what we've been doing, what our competitors have as well, to try and give a balanced view. And I'll talk for about 10 minutes or so, and then we can do some questions and discussion, which is probably more interesting than listening to me rant on. So we started looking at the demand and the gap in the market for specialist modern Grade A industrial and logistics facilities about 2 years ago. I and my business partner had been doing modern warehousing. We brought modern warehousing to Russia, where we built up a big portfolio, and then we listed that on the London Stock Exchange. And then about 2 years ago, I started with my rucksack coming to visit Africa. I'd never done anything in Africa before, and done any projects here. And just sort of trying to work it out and see what the fundamentals were doing, where supply and demand laid, where was the product market fit, and fundamentally, was it the right time? Because I think the timing is the biggest question. And when looking at going across all of North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and Southern Africa, the problem we really identified was, as this sort of picture illustrates, which is one of my sort of favorite warehousing pictures, if you can get excited about warehousing pictures. And this is a typical go down in Kenya, where you've got old style, Indian type, small 1,000 square meter units. They've got low eaves. They have a very high site coverage, so a very small amount of yard space, as you can see in the picture, with a large amount of, there's trucks, there's no truck flow. It's very inefficient. You've got containers in the yard, poor utilities, and really just a very inefficient industrial facility. And you compare that to what you have in SA and Europe and the States and Asia, a world apart. So, for example, in Kenya, with a city of 4 million people, a fast-growing GDP of over 5%, and a consumer base that is on the rise, there's nothing else apart from this type of product in the city for rental occupiers, both local companies, regional and multinational companies. So the question is, was Kenya, and indeed are other cities in the continent, ready for that next step in the evolution of warehousing? And particularly for East Africa, I think the best comparable is not South Africa, but actually India, because in East Africa you have a very high Indian population, and business is very much driven by the Indian business community there. So you really need to look at India and see how that's developed, and that's moved quite swiftly over the last 5 years to Grade A warehousing, to see where Kenya and East Africa can head. And over the last 2 years, that's what we've been doing. We set up Africa Logistics Properties. We raised just over $60 million last March. We put together a team, and we've just finished our first project of nearly 50,000 square meters in northern Nairobi, and we've got another project in the west. So we've been moving quite quickly. I thought I'd put up this graph from JLL, and JLL did some research last year on the prime industrial market in Africa. And like with all good graphs, there's lots of assumptions behind it. But what's interesting is that industrial tends to be the ugly duckling of the property sector, particularly with local developers. Offices, hotels, and retail tend to be the more sexy end of the market, and also tend to be particularly offices and retail have tended to be the first sectors that investors have come into. Industrial tends to be left behind. So we felt that was a sort of bit of greenfield space for us, and to bring our experience across other emerging markets into a dedicated Africa platform. What the graph shows is, you can see Southern Africa was forecast to take a dip. I think that's panning out as forecast. If you look at what's happening in South Africa at the moment, we expect to see a bit of a downturn on the industrial property market and wider property sector generally. I think it will be more pronounced personally than shown on this graph. North Africa continues a steady stream up. We do like certain parts of North Africa, Cairo in particular, and Morocco, where we think there's a growing need for modern industrial facilities, particularly with those two countries, and they have with their high manufacturing bases. In Western Africa, as expected, it took a bit of a slump and pounding with the currency and the commodities drop. But we do think long-term the fundamentals are very good in West Africa. And indeed, one of our competitors, Agility, I think has been taking a good, smart, long-term view with the land banks they've been acquiring of industrial land across the region. And then Eastern Africa, where we set up camp, we focused in Kenya. And Kenya, as you know, Nairobi is the principal base. 60% of consumer demand is in Nairobi. And with a city of 4 million people, there was just no grade A warehousing. So I think on this chart, the bulk of the forecast demand is primarily Kenya as a hub. Tanzania, we think long-term will come right, but it's going to take a few years yet until the government settles down. And Ethiopia, as it opens up, will become attractive, but from a property investment model at the moment, still has some challenges in terms of currency in and out, and permits and a few other things. I mean, be interesting afterwards. People might have a different view on this and where you think the best region to make your bets on. Challenges, we've had lots of challenges. I'll talk about challenges threefold. Firstly, there's the market challenges. I think when you're bringing a new product, as we have, into a new market which is not familiar with it, that's an interesting challenge to sell the product and to lease it. When we I'll use ALP as an example. When we started in Kenya, I'd persuaded my investors to give us $60 million to do something we'd never done before in Africa, never done before in Kenya, with no team set up and a completely speculative basis. We had no pre-leases or tenants at all. So that was a big challenge. In addition to that, you're trying to convert the market and take both regional, local, and multinational companies away from a traditional history of using small units that are generally spread out. And also what's important, and I've tried to show it here in a simple diagram, but to get away from the mindset of ownership. The economist from Deloitte who spoke this morning said that culture drives commerce, and I think that's very true. I think Africa really is split into those regions, and when you look at the industrial sector, those cultural nuances really dictate the type of product and the industrial and the type of take-up that you get from it. Especially in East Africa, where there's been a very high ownership component. Most tenants, or most regional tenants, when they're looking at our space, it really falls into that affordability, ownership, and the efficiencies they'll get out of it. Ownership, the cost benefit of building your own facilities is a really big point we found in East Africa, and I think across the continent. And to do that cost benefit and make sure they're doing a like for like analysis, it means you need to spend a lot of time with occupiers and tenants. And we've worn out a lot of shoe leather going up and down Nairobi's industrial areas and sitting down with tenants to really show the benefits of moving to our space. The other challenge is affordability. Our rents, we've moved the benchmark up for industrial rents in Kenya where we are, so ours are effectively double what rents were historically. That makes it sound expensive, but of course the features of our industrial units, such as 12-meter eaves, dock doors, high load capacity floors, and the other grade A attributes you'd be familiar with from facilities down in SA and across the world in more developed markets. That's new for them. So you need to get them away from the just looking at a specific price point, but really say, look, your pallet costs per square metre are actually going to fall by about 30-40%, and that's before you overlay the operational efficiencies on top, such as the simple things such as faster truck turnaround times, better inventory management, wider access to warehouse management systems and the implementation of that, and tracking through, and less labour as well, and then tracking through all those and including all those into a cost-benefit exercise. And then to get tenants away from focusing on rent to actually focusing on value derived per square metre of space from that new type of facility. And that takes time. And that's the biggest lesson we've learned. You know, I'm just some English guy who's turned up in Kenya. But that's the real lesson we've learned coming in, that it takes longer to do that. And then, of course, location in the middle is important. And we've sort of bucked the trend there and done something different. In Kenya and the other cities we're looking at, you know, most industrial areas do tend to be quite ingrained within the city centre or very close to it. And when we've been developing warehouses, you know, I've been doing this for 15 years now, when we've been doing warehouses in other emerging markets, the trend is always the same. The industrial hubs move out of those centres. The centre of the cities just get too congested with traffic. It's a matter of time before they start banning or restricting truck movements, which again moves people out. And over time, the main roads and access routes do improve. And we're seeing that happen in Kenya. So the bet we made was that that would happen in Nairobi. And our sites are in the regions, in the suburban hubs, where we see upcoming infrastructure moving in. And of course, the paradigm here in Africa is, in other developed markets, you wait for the infrastructure to go in, and then you'll build your projects around that. Here it's the other way around. You sort of say, I'm going to make a bet on a project in this location, and then you wait for the roads to catch up, particularly in Kenya. Well, it's not just about ALP. We're one of three, really. We're based in Nairobi. And then we've got three other major players, including us, in Africa, one of which is Agility, who is sitting here today, and then the South African developer Improvon, who are tied up with Actis. It's very easy to see the difference between our facilities. Ours are green, Agility's are red, and Improvon are blue. So if you're driving past, it's super simple. Agility have made very good progress. You know, they're a large Kuwaiti logistics group doing logistics services as well, but they have developed warehouses in Ghana. I know they started in Côte d'Ivoire. They've got about 400 acres in the land bank, which I think is a good strategic move. And they've also recently announced their project in Maputo, where they're starting on 30,000 square meters. So they've very much got a West African theme through that. I think the timing's good. You know, Lagos in particular we like as a market for industrial. It's obviously had a large setback with the commodity and currencies, but you know, the size of the market, you just can't ignore it. You know, Nigeria is the elephant in the room. Improvon, obviously well ensconced down here in SA, but they have been a bit slow to advance into Kenya, where they have bought some land, but they haven't started yet. They've got their York Industrial Park, where I think they've built about 10,000 square meters there in Zambia. And then there's us sitting in Nairobi, covering East Africa. So that's sort of how the industrial players looks at the moment. And from that map, just talking about opportunities in Africa, I think this sort of map highlights the main areas we think are attractive, and that's Nairobi in East Africa, Lagos and Ghana in West Africa, Casablanca region, Cairo in the north, and we are, from ALP's point of view, we are looking at North Africa quite seriously. And then, of course, you've got the southern artery with Zambia, Angola we'll see long term, and I actually think Zimbabwe will surprise quite a few people in the years to come as it restores its position, hopefully, as things settle down there. So in terms of our competition, just to give you a flavour of what everyone's doing. This is Improvon in York Industrial Park. Similar units to what you'd be familiar with up near the airport here. They've done smaller units than us, generally about 6-metre eaves, no raised docks, just shutter doors, but a pretty good unit size for that type of market. And then they've bought some land in the northeast of Nairobi. They've called it Nairobi Gate, and with Actis, and they are planning to do a small amount of speculative building there, but primarily they really want to do built to suit. Personally, I don't think that works. I think you've got to be speculative in the market. You've got to demonstrate, especially to the multinationals, that you have delivery capability, integrity, and financial robustness. I just don't think people occupiers will take you seriously otherwise. Agility, who we think are our main competitor. As you can see, slightly different and larger unit design. This one, I think, and Jeff will correct me if I'm wrong, is in Ghana. And Agility have made a good start there. You would have seen some recent press about their occupiers. But again, I think this is more what you're used to seeing for a sort of proper grade A unit, large yard on a big master plan site, and again designed as a multi-tenant unit. And that's key. It goes back to the affordability point. You need to be able to cut up these large boxes into smaller tenant use. You can't just say, I'm building a 5,000 square metre unit, I'm going to stick some office on the side and just hope for one tenant to come along. That's not how it works. You really need to have that capability to go from sort of 1,000 square metres up to 20,000 square metres and be flexible with the space to do that. So the design needs to accommodate that. This is what we've done in Kenya. I'll show you some real pictures in a minute, but it's quite a good summary. We did 50,000 square metres in Nairobi. We did a big bet on a 22-acre site. We built this in 12 months from start to finish, on schedule, I'm pleased to say, and on budget. So we've been quite fast on this one. On Unit 1, which is in the top of the page, we did a single lease for nearly 14,000 square metres. It's the largest industrial lease to date in Kenya to a 3PL regional group called Freight Forwarders. On Unit 2, which is to the left, that's 60% leased, but we're hoping to be fully leased within the coming month. With our pipeline, we've got an e-commerce company in there doing regional distribution of FMCG products across Kenya. We've got the largest paper and print distributor in the region coming in, and there's 2 multinationals we're in advanced talks with for the remainder of the space. All our leases are dollars. We've got good indexation. We're happy with the returns we're hitting to make it all viable. And leases are generally quite long-term, actually, from about 5 to 15 years. We've also got a large American cold storage company coming in on Unit 3, which is to the right, and they are putting in their Nairobi's very first purpose-built cold storage facility. Cold chain is an interesting one, I think, in terms of opportunities in the industrial space. Cold chain's a big one. Whilst we're not cold chain operators per se, we do think having an allocation of facilities and in terms of the design and the master plan of sites allowing for cold chain is definitely a worthwhile point for us. We incorporate it into all our projects. And that goes with the utilities requirements and electricity you need to run those as well. This is our first site. It's just opened last week. And that's Unit 1, 13,500 square metres of the overall 47,000 square metres. Nice sunny day in Nairobi. Multi-tenant unit, office running along the front, 4 cores with the access points so that we can chop it up. Raised docks, we put extra large doors in so you can handle shipping containers as well, so we put in oversized doors. We've got solar on the roof. We've just got the World Bank certification for green, for excellence in design for greater efficiencies. We're the first warehousing complex in Africa to get the World Bank certification for sustainability. We're quite proud of. I think it's a win-win-win. It's good for the asset valuation. It's good for tenants. Their operating costs are about 30% less as a result of our features like solar panel, rainwater harvesting, LED lighting, and thermal systems on the walls and the roof. That's our finished unit. It's opened last week. looks slightly camouflaged behind the plant, but the first occupiers are moving in 2 weeks. So we're very busy getting that ready for them at the moment. And here's a good example. You know, I showed you the pictures of Improvon and Agility. You know, everyone has done slightly different tweaks, I think for good reason, because each country does have different demand dynamics in terms of the space. Here we've gone for the full grade A spec or standard grade A spec with 12-meter heights. I think heights is the biggest variable on the warehousings if you look across. And I think there's a good rationale for having 3 types of products: a 12-meter full grade A box, a 9 to 7 meter mid box, and then a sort of 6 meter small units, 500 to 1,000 square meters. And a good example here in SA is actually Innospace, who've been making that work quite well by using renovating old industrial units. What's next? We're doing, on the back of what we did on our first project, we've got a 50-acre site in western Nairobi. We did the infrastructure in parallel with the first site in the north of Nairobi over the last few months. The road is all finished now, actually, and we're ready to start construction. The good news is we've got 2 multinationals we're in advanced talks with for 20,000 square meters on the first phase, first 2 phases, actually. And we hope to have more news in the public domain later on this year about that, and that will kick off that project in western Nairobi, and that sits right adjacent to the main highway that goes off to the western cities of Kisumu and then Nakuru and then on into Uganda and Kampala. So we think that's a really good strategic site for us there. So in summary, I think, without being biased, we think industrial is the strongest sector actually in Africa, because it's not just a property sector, it's fundamental infrastructure. I think that's a big difference to offices and retail. You know, it's just, especially with, and you see this in East Africa and Kenya a lot, with e-commerce moving quite fast and the technology play, you're seeing this leapfrog, and those warehouse facilities to enable such things as e-commerce will really be required going forwards, and particularly on food. Actually, we're seeing a lot more food and beverage companies, and we're also seeing a lot more Asian tenants come into the market. You know, we're currently dealing with some Japanese and Chinese tenants at the moment who we haven't seen before, so that's quite interesting. They're coming into the region. I've sort of whizzed through that in 15 minutes, so I'll stop, and if there's any questions and discussion, maybe we could do that. Thank you. So is there any questions people want to throw out? Yeah, a gentleman in the back.
Any consideration given to building precast or tilt-up as opposed to block and metal buildings?
No, it's a good question. We've looked at that, just as we've looked at modular building as well. You know, we want to build faster, cheaper, and quicker. I think the tilt-up panels I'm not a big fan of, because I think they're inflexible for industrial buildings in terms of, if I go back here, for example, I mean, what you can't see in that picture is actually, we put in ghost docks, for example, and where you see the white dock doors, for example, to the right of the ones on the right-hand side, there's 2 dock doors. The grey space to the right actually is a ghost door. You can actually knock through, and we can put in another dock. Again, it's all about being flexible with our tenant requirements. So putting in, I don't like the tilt-up panels. Whilst, yes, they're quicker, we think doing block work to about 3 meters and then sandwich panels and sheeting above is quite effective for us, and those materials we've sourced locally in East Africa. You know, other countries, the sourcing of those materials and costs and relative costs of those materials vary. So yes, then there can be an argument for doing tilt-up panels. We've looked at, we're looking increasingly at modular building. I think for some of the units, we may well incorporate modular building. And I know, for example, Agility, for example, don't have columns in the center of their units. They've gone for wide span roofs. So everyone's sort of done slightly different tweaks. Again, I think it's really what the market works and what makes your development economics stack up in terms of driving the cost and the product performance you want and the specifications. I think for Nairobi, this based on the tenant feedback we've had, sort of works. We're making a few tweaks on further buildings, but broadly speaking, this works in Nairobi. I mean, Kenya is good because, of course, it's got Mombasa as a seaport, so access to materials is relatively efficient, providing they don't lose your container when it comes up the railway, which happens a few times. But doing a facility, for example, in Uganda or one of the landlocked countries, then you want to sort of reduce your reliance on imported goods coming in by sea, because of course you've got to get them across the borders, and that's not cheap or quick. How's that? Right. Any other questions? Yes.
You mentioned reading that Egypt was
Yeah.
You mentioned that Egypt was growing and it was for sure will require additional industrial space for sure. But I didn't see that market as a priority for you.
No, it's somewhere we've been looking at. I've done a couple of visits to Cairo. I don't profess to be an expert on Egypt. I'm not. But what we've seen there is industrial property development has been quite muted, along with the other sectors, because, of course, the Egyptian pound fell, and Egyptian pound interest rates went up to 12%. So why would you take property development risk when you're getting 12% in the bank? And so generally it's been owner-occupier development by firms who just want their own facilities, and they're not doing it from an investment model like we are. So we do see opportunities there. I wouldn't be naive enough, as I say to other people, to just jump off a plane and think, I can do it all on our own. We don't. And we would be seeking both there and other North African markets to do it with local partners who know those nuances well, and then we can combine where there's a good fit of our expertise and capital, etc., to make a project work. We stick very much to our guns on putting our own people on the ground permanently. So we don't believe in the fly-in, fly-out model. Wherever we'll be, we'll have permanent people in those cities. Anyone else? Yes, gentleman at the back.
Thanks. So I've seen your warehouses in Nairobi. They're great. I just wanted to ask you, just given the land costs there and the specification and the delivery, how do you achieve your required yield? It must be quite difficult.
Yeah, good question. I actually think that question can be applied to a lot of countries in Africa.
And cities. I'll give you an example in Nairobi based on our experience. Firstly, sourcing those land sites, you've got to be local based. You're just not going to get the relationships with the sellers or find the right plots or have the credibility if you're not there, boots on the ground and part of that village. And I was talking to someone earlier, Nairobi is a village, as are many other cities. The values will change if people have a better perception of you and believe in you. I think in Nairobi, if you look at Mombasa Road, the traditional industrial area, land prices at the moment can vary quite a lot, anything but generally from about $800,000 to $1 million an acre. Now, there's lots of historical go-down warehousing there. Do warehouse economics work there? No, not at those prices. No one in this room, in their right mind, would go and build a warehouse on land that much, because your rents just would be astronomical. You'd never get a tenant. But there's a legacy issue there, because you've got a lot of Indian families and business families who've owned this land for 50, 60 years, and it's not so much a yield play for them. They're quite happy sitting on it. I think what you're starting to see in the industrial areas in Mombasa Road, for example, is sort of gentrification and different mixed-use projects coming in, where you're getting the better, highest and best land use on those sites. So we're seeing more top-end residential, replacing some industrial land there. You're seeing shopping malls, smaller shopping malls, more utility retail. And it goes back to my earlier point that that's why we looked at where are those main transport and logistics hubs around the city, in those sort of ring road areas. So our land costs were considerably less than $800,000 an acre equivalent. And that's how we've made our economics work. And we've found that even though we're further away from the airport and we're further away from the cargo area where the SGR railway comes in from Mombasa, that hasn't really affected why people want to come in, only in a few cases. You know, they want better facilities with better access in less congested areas, and that's really important to them. So, you know, again, if you believe that the road and structure will improve, then we think it will come. And also, I mean, you know, things like the SGR railway, which has been much muted in Kenya, it still has a lot of teething and management problems. You know, from a logistics point of view, you still got to truck your goods in your container from the ship to the train terminal, put it on the train goes all the way up to Mombasa, it stops short, you've then still got to put it on another truck, take it to wherever it's going. You know, it actually costs more. It's about, you know, $700 more than just sticking it on a truck from Mombasa straight up to Nairobi to your point of destination. So, but the government's enforcing that everyone must use a railway to recoup the cost of it. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, time will tell if our theory prevails with our occupancy, but, you know, so far so good. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time and listening.